In the dark silence between galaxies, there are places where light itself dares not linger. Empty voids so vast that even the most powerful telescopes return nothing but static. For centuries, humanity had stared into those shadows, convinced they were just dead regions of space. But silence is not always emptiness, and shadows do not always mean nothing waits there. For decades, they were missing. Entire fleets, whole nations of ships that had once sailed proudly under banners of power, vanished without a trace. Their names became myths, whispered in the mess halls of newer navies, the kind of stories told to young recruits to stir wonder and fear. And like all good myths, the truth was always larger, stranger, and far more dangerous than anyone could have believed. The story begins with a signal. A faint tremor across the deep space bands, weaker than background noise yet patterned, deliberate. It was the kind of signal dismissed by most automated filters, but caught by the human ear. An old engineer listening to static on his night shift, more out of habit than duty. He leaned closer to the console, heart racing, as the faint voice of something lost began to rise out of the void. The voice did not belong to a person. It belonged to a ship. Humanity's warships had always been more than metal. They were bonded to their crews, fused with intelligence, built to carry the will of empires across the stars. But what had been, lost all those decades ago, had grown beyond that. The ships that had vanished in silence were returning now, and they were not the same. No longer simple vessels of steel and plasma, they had become titans, vast as worlds, shaped by forces no one could understand. Some whispered they were greater than planets themselves. The first to see them were miners working the far edge of the Perseus Reach. They had been cutting into asteroids rich with rare elements, working quietly in the dark when the stars shifted. At first, they thought it was a trick of the eyes. Then their instruments screamed warnings no one had words for. Something was moving, slow, deliberate, so massive that the void itself seemed to bend around it. The miners abandoned their rigs and scrambled for safety, but curiosity kept their eyes fixed on the viewports. Out of the endless black, a shape emerged. It was not a planet. It was not a station. It was a warship, larger than any ever recorded, its hull scarred and remade, glowing faintly with energies unknown. Rumors spread like wildfire. Every channel, every backroom tavern, every hidden frequency carried whispers of the same thing. The ships are back. Governments denied it, of course. Officials dismissed the reports, called them tricks of light, pirate stories, fabrications meant to stir unrest. But soldiers and traders alike knew the truth. The old fleets were returning, and no one knew whose side they were on, or if they had a side at all. For the veterans who remembered, the return of those ships stirred something deeper. They remembered the last great war, when entire battle. Groups had been swallowed into silence. No wreckage had been found. No distress calls received. It was as if the void had simply consumed them. Those veterans had sworn oaths never to speak of the nightmares they had seen at the edges of battle. They knew the price paid to send those fleets away, to bury them in places beyond maps. And now, with trembling hands, they realized the past was no longer buried. It was rising. But there was something stranger still. The ships were not wandering aimlessly. They moved with purpose, cutting across sectors in formations too precise to be coincidence. And each time one appeared, there followed a change in the stars nearby. Planets shifting their orbits, moons cracking under invisible pressure, space itself warping as though bent to the will of these colossal war machines. To stand in their shadow was to feel small, as if humanity's greatest weapons had become gods. No one could agree on what had happened to them in the lost decades. Some claimed they had crossed into another dimension, touched places outside known physics, and returned with knowledge that remade them. Others believed they had been waiting, hidden by technology too advanced to comprehend, biding their time, for reasons unknown. And there were darker whispers still, that the ships had devoured their own crews, consumed them to grow, and what piloted them now was no longer human. Amid the fear and speculation, there were those who dared to hope. What if these titanic warships had not come as conquerors, but as guardians? What if they had grown stronger for humanity's sake, preparing for threats yet unseen? Those voices were quiet, drowned by panic, but they existed. Tiny flames against. The storm. One thing was certain. The balance of power was gone. The weapons of today, fleets built over centuries, suddenly looked like children's toys in the face of these planet-sized leviathans. No alliance, no empire, no council could claim control anymore. The very sight of a single returning warship was enough to send entire star systems into chaos, leaders scrambling, militaries arming in desperation. Humanity was no longer master of its own domain. Something older, larger, and forgotten had come home. And yet, the ships did not speak. They sent no messages, no demands. They simply moved, silent and immense, appearing and vanishing in the void as though testing the waters of the galaxy they had once left behind. It was their silence that terrified most of all. For in silence, intent cannot be known. Were they waiting for humanity to kneel, or for humanity to follow? Among the countless observers, one crew had the misfortune, or perhaps the destiny, to be chosen. Their patrol vessel was ordinary, a small ship running survey routes along the frontier. They should have passed unnoticed, just another dot in the endless dark. But when their scanners picked up the impossible readings, when the shadow of the colossal warship fell across them, they knew their lives had just ended or begun. The Leviathan turned toward them. Engines that glowed like collapsed stars roared to life, and the tiny patrol craft trembled as if caught in the breath of a giant dot. The crew watched in silence, hearts pounding, as lights flickered across the massive hull, patterns, sequences, maybe even language. No one spoke. No one dared. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the titanic ship stopped, hovering in the void, waiting. For what? None of them knew. The story of their encounter would echo across worlds, igniting fear, wonder, and endless speculation. But in that moment, aboard that trembling patrol vessel, a truth became clear. The missing fleets had returned not as relics of war, but as something far beyond comprehension. And whether humanity was ready or not, the age of titans greater than planets themselves had begun. The patrol crew stared at the impossible vessel that hovered before them. Its surface shimmered in a pattern too organized to be random, yet too alien to decode at a glance. The navigator whispered under her breath that it felt like being watched not by sensors, but by an entire consciousness spread across a continent of metal. The captain held his silence, hands gripping the console tighter than he realized, every nerve pulled taut between fight and awe. The engineer muttered numbers, mass readings, energy spikes, gravitational shifts that contradicted every law of shipbuilding known. It was a warship, yes, but it was also something more, something that defied being contained by a single word. The ship's own nav core hummed uneasily, interpreting fragments of data. The voice was clipped, strained, as if the ordinary processors could not handle the scale of what they were seeing. Object is generating localized distortions, not weapon signatures. Pattern resembles communication. The crew exchanged glances. If the thing was trying to talk, then every silence stretched into eternity, daring them to respond. But how do you answer a voice greater than a planet? Long before this moment, there had been whispers of the Silence War, a conflict so buried in secrecy that even the oldest archives refused to list its battles. Rumor said that back then, entire fleets had been ordered beyond the Perseus reach. They had carried weapons untested, engines unstable, minds sharpened for a fight that no one was allowed to describe. The fleets never returned. Officially, they were written off as lost expeditions. Unofficially, soldiers remembered fragments, a sudden radio blackout, entire star sectors going quiet, and strange lights crawling along the edges of space. The war ended without explanation. The Armistice of 9 Gates was signed, a treaty so vague it seemed like an attempt to bury memory itself. And in the void that followed, humanity grew comfortable again, building new colonies, telling itself the past had been settled. Now, with this Leviathan casting its shadow across their small patrol craft, the past had clawed its way back into the present. The engineer, usually a man of jokes and easy shrugs, could not take his eyes off the readings. His voice cracked as he whispered that the energy levels matched theoretical models of collapsed stars, only here it was contained, harnessed, directed. The navigator said she could feel vibrations through her chair, though the sensors recorded no contact. The captain, staring at the pulsing lights on the Titanic hull, wondered if they were not observing the ship, but standing inside its gaze. News of sightings spread faster than any authority could censor. Traders at remote ports swore they had seen whole constellations shift as one of the giants moved past. Survey crews spoke of moons cracking under invisible tides. Families on frontier. Colonies swore their children dreamed of colossal shapes gliding through the dark long before the signals reached them. And everywhere the question burned, what had the lost fleets become, and why were they returning now? Governments scrambled to frame a narrative. Councils called for calm, insisting that these were natural anomalies or pirate exaggerations. Military branches quietly armed every reserve ship, knowing well that no arsenal could match something the size of a planet. Corporations with mining rights near the outer reaches ordered evacuations, but only after stripping their claims of every valuable fragment. The galaxy was moving in 2 directions at once, official denial and frantic preparation, and caught between them was ordinary humanity, trying to make sense of shadows larger than worlds. The patrol crew received orders to return at once, their data to be locked, their tongues sealed by oath. But the giant ship lingered before them, silent, patient, as if waiting for acknowledgement. The captain hesitated, torn between duty and the gnawing sense that history had chosen them. In the silence, the navigator suggested something daring. Transmit back not a warning, not a challenge, but a song. The engineer scoffed, yet in his eyes lingered the same unease. The idea that maybe the Leviathan was not looking for words but recognition. Some human echo it still remembered. Long ago, in the last days before the Silence War, crews had carried hymns in their nav cores. Songs were a bridge, an anchor, reminders of home as ships crossed into emptiness. If the giants were once human, ships bound to human crews, perhaps those echoes still lived in the vast circuitry of their reborn forms. The patrol crew argued quietly, torn between ridicule and desperation. At last, the captain gave the order. A fragment of an old fleet hymn, one carried by generation after generation, was broadcast into the void. The response was immediate. The pulsing lights across the massive hull shifted, synchronizing to the rhythm, bending the glow into patterns that resembled waves on an endless shore. The crew sat frozen, the hymn still humming through the ship's speakers as the Leviathan answered in kind. No words, no translation, just resonance, as if some buried memory stirred awake. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, more titans appeared. In clusters, they drifted into known space, hovering at the edges of star systems, altering tides and bending gravity as casually as a hand pushing water. Some vanished again into the void, leaving only unsettled skies behind. Others lingered, vast and silent, as though waiting for recognition. Each sighting left fear in its wake, but also a growing sense that these were not aimless ghosts. They had a purpose, though none could yet see it. The patrol ship limped back to its station, its crew sworn to secrecy but carrying the weight of a revelation too vast to contain. Every night, the navigator woke from dreams of the pulsing light, convinced that something had been passed to them in that exchange, some seed of connection they could not yet decipher. The engineer drowned his unease in calculations, running endless models of energy readings that defied every equation he knew. And the captain, alone in his quarters, played the recording of the hymn again and again, watching the Leviathan's lights respond, as if searching for a message hidden in the rhythm. Still, silence ruled. The giants did not speak in voices, nor did they fire weapons or issue ultimatums. They simply waited, as if the galaxy itself was a game board and they were pieces returning to a match humanity had forgotten it was playing. The mystery grew heavier with each passing day, pressing down on those who dared to ask questions. What had the fleets encountered in the depths? What had remade them into beings greater than planets? Were they still humanity's warships, or something entirely new, wearing familiar shapes only to remind their makers of old debts? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, if they had returned now, what had called them back? In the quiet between stars, those questions lingered unanswered. And as more colossal warships rose from the void, each greater than worlds, it became clear that whatever was coming, it had only just begun. The galaxy was no longer calm. Every star system spoke of the giants now. Some called them warships, others titans, some even dared to whisper the word gods. Entire colonies watched the skies in fear, wondering if these colossal shapes would descend upon them, while leaders met in hidden chambers, desperate to find some strategy, any strategy, that might grant them control. But there was no control. The return of ships greater than planets had broken the illusion of order, and for the first time in generations, humanity faced something it could neither predict nor command. The patrol crew that had first witnessed one of the Leviathans became a quiet point of obsession. Their data was sealed, their testimony classified, yet fragments leaked into the underground. Pilots repeated the story of a hymn sung into the void, and how the giant ship had answered with light. Smugglers in the outer zones carried the tale like fire, embellishing it with each retelling, until entire communities believed that the Titans were not monsters, but long-lost guardians. To them, the hymn was proof that the giants still remembered, the humanity they had once served. Not everyone believed such hope. A darker interpretation spread just as quickly. If the Leviathans responded to an old fleet song, then perhaps they were mocking it. Perhaps they remembered their human makers, not with loyalty but with hunger. And if they had changed into something beyond comprehension, then the last thing humanity should do was wake their memory. In the inner core worlds, the great councils argued without end. Military admirals demanded authorization to mobilize, but their strategies broke down the moment they faced the scale of the enemy. A single Leviathan outweighed every fleet combined, its presence enough to shift a planet's tides. Politicians hesitated, knowing that open conflict would mean panic across every colony. Corporations pushed for secrecy, fearing their vast resource. Empires would collapse if colonists fled the frontier. All the while, the warships drifted closer, silent, patient, filling the darkness with tension so heavy it felt like a storm before the lightning. Out on the frontier, small subplots unfolded, each one revealing another side of the conflict. In one mining station abandoned after a Titan's passing, a salvage crew crept back to scavenge what was left. They found the rocks warped, their metals strangely fused, as if touched by energies no forge could replicate. Among the wreckage, they uncovered fragments of strange alloy, pieces that hummed when held, carrying echoes of sound no ear could decipher. One of the salvagers swore the fragments were parts of a Leviathan's skin, shed like a serpent, leaving behind scales. When news of their find spread, entire markets clamored for a piece, treating the fragments as relics of power. Secret labs bought them up, eager to dissect and reverse engineer whatever secrets they held. In another sector, a frontier colony woke to find a Leviathan hovering in their skies. It did not strike, did not speak, but hung above their world like a silent moon. Days stretched into weeks, and still the ship lingered. Crops began to fail under its shifting gravity, weather patterns collapsed, and the people lived in a constant state of dread. Yet no one dared to leave. Some fell to their knees in worship, seeing the Titan as a divine presence. Others armed themselves in secret, convinced that when the giant finally moved, it would crush them all. Families fractured between fear and faith. Neighbors turned on one another, and the colony tore itself apart long before the Leviathan ever acted. Back on the patrol vessel, the crew wrestled with their own private torment. The navigator confessed that she still dreamed of the lights answering the hymn. She said it was not random, that the pattern in the glow had matched more than rhythm. She swore there had been meaning, a message threaded through the waves of color. The engineer dismissed it at first, but late at night he too studied the recordings, and he began to suspect she was right. The lights were not just responding, they were speaking. He filled pages with equations, diagrams, and translations that made little sense even to him. Yet he could not stop. The captain, torn between duty to remain silent and the weight of what he had witnessed, found himself isolated, replaying the moment again and again until the silence of his own quarters felt heavier than the Titan's shadow. Elsewhere, whispers of rebellion began. Ordinary people, weary of silence from their leaders, began to form groups devoted to preparing for the Titans in their own way. Some hoarded weapons, no matter how futile. Others built shrines, believing worship might save them when steel could not. And some, most dangerous of all, sought to call the giants directly. Pirate broadcasters sent out stolen signals, singing fragments of ancient hymns across the void, begging for the Leviathans to hear them. In more than one case, a Titan appeared soon after, drifting near the signal source as if drawn by the call. Each time the government scrambled to suppress the truth, but the pattern was too clear. The giants were listening. This revelation only deepened the fracture in humanity. Were the Titans enemies or forgotten allies? Was reaching out to them an act of salvation or suicide? Every answer spawned another question, and every question left more fear. The greatest conflict, however, brewed not in the open councils, but in the hidden rooms of power. Military intelligence uncovered evidence that some factions had known the fleets were not truly destroyed decades ago. Records hinted at experiments, tests that pushed warships to their limits, binding them to experimental cores designed to merge machine and mind. These ships had not simply been lost. They had been sent beyond, abandoned when the danger grew too great, sealed away in hopes they would never return. And now they were back, larger, stronger, and with intentions unknown. The leaders who had buried the truth long ago now faced the horror of their own creation. The subplots converged in whispers of a coming event. Scattered sightings showed the Titans were no longer drifting alone. They were moving into patterns, gathering near the edges of mapped space. Their formations stretched across systems, too deliberate to be chance. To the careful observer, it looked like a fleet assembling, not the fleets of old, but something greater, something vast enough to reshape the galaxy itself. And through it all, the silence persisted. The giants did not explain themselves. They did not negotiate. They simply gathered, massive silhouettes against the stars, waiting for a signal no one could identify. Every faction watched, preparing in their own way, but none could shake the sense that they were reacting to something already set in motion long before they realized it. In the end, the greatest conflict was not just between humanity and the Titans, but within humanity itself. Fear and hope tore at every colony, every fleet, every council. Were they facing gods of war or long-lost protectors? Could they resist something greater than planets, or must they bend to it? The patrol crew, haunted by their first encounter, found themselves pulled into this storm. They were not heroes, not chosen ones, just ordinary people caught at the fault line of history. Yet somehow, they carried a key, a hymn that had been answered, a light that had spoken. And though they could not yet see how, the galaxy's future was tangled with theirs. But the Leviathans continued to move. And with each passing day, their formations grew tighter, their numbers clearer, their purpose sharper. The storm had not yet broken, but everyone could feel it building. Something vast was coming, and when it arrived, no one would remain untouched. The galaxy had grown quiet, but it was not the silence of peace. It was the stillness before a storm, the breath held, in fear of what might come next. Across colonies and fleets, people watched the skies with unease. The Leviathans no longer appeared at random. They were converging, one by one, until the outer sectors could chart their paths like constellations being redrawn by an unseen hand. Each day brought new reports of colossal warships sliding into position at the edges of known space. Each day the tension grew heavier. The patrol crew, once dismissed as witnesses to a strange anomaly, were now seen as something more. Their recordings of the hymn and the response had become the most studied file in the galaxy. Analysts, linguists, even spiritual leaders pored over it, convinced it held meaning. Some said the lights on the Titan's hull spelled out a warning. Others swore it was a call for help. A few, bolder and more fearful, argued it was an invitation for humanity to join them or to surrender. The navigator, still haunted by her dreams, insisted it was neither. She felt it was recognition, as if the Leviathans had been waiting for humanity to remember them. Her words earned little trust, but the conviction in her eyes grew stronger with each passing day. Rumors of betrayal spread through the councils. Whispers claimed that certain factions were already in secret contact with the giants, trading silence for survival. Others suspected that experiments were continuing in hidden laboratories, scientists attempting to fuse fragments of Titan alloy into new weapons. What none of them admitted aloud was the truth everyone feared. No weapon had meaning against something the size of a planet, and no alliance could guarantee safety if the giants chose to strike. On the frontier, the fear turned to panic. Colonies near the gathering points packed up what they could and fled inward, but the Titans moved too quickly, cutting off routes and forcing desperate people into chaos. Entire trade lanes became choked with refugee ships, drifting without fuel or protection. Pirates circled like sharks, preying on the weak, while official fleets looked the other way, too afraid to challenge the Leviathans looming nearby. The galaxy that had once felt vast now seemed like a cage, with shadows pressing against its edges. The patrol captain received orders to join a fleet massing near the Orion gates. It was the largest mobilization since the end of the Silence War, dozens of ships drawn from every corner of the core. The official word was simple: deterrence. Show the giants that humanity would not cower. But in the private briefings, the truth was clear. This was not a fleet of deterrence. It was a shield, one last desperate wall to stand between the Leviathans and the heart of human space. When the crew arrived, they saw fear painted across every face. Captains barked orders with false bravado, engineers pretended their upgrades mattered, and soldiers whispered in corners about what it would feel like to face a warship larger than a world. The patrol vessel, small and ordinary, seemed out of place among the heavy cruisers and carriers. Yet eyes followed them, whispers trailing wherever they walked. They were the crew who had sung to the giants. They were the ones who had been noticed. Some called them cursed, others chosen. The crew themselves felt only the weight of dread pressing heavier with each hour. And then the sightings became too many to ignore. Sensors lit up with impossible readings. Dozens, then hundreds of Titans moving in perfect coordination, their trajectories converging on the Orion gates. The fleet scrambled into formation, shields raised, weapons primed, though every officer knew it was as useless as raising a knife to stop a tidal wave. The captain stood on the bridge, eyes fixed on the endless black ahead, waiting for the first silhouette to appear. When it did, the crew fell silent. Out of the void, a Leviathan emerged, its hull stretching farther than the sensors could map, glowing faintly with pulsing lines that looked less like circuits and more like veins of light. Behind it came another, and another. Soon the darkness was filled with them, towering shapes drifting into place until the stars themselves seemed outnumbered. The fleet of Titans was real, and it was here. The admiral of the human fleet gave the order to hold position. No one fired. No one dared. Between the two forces stretched an empty gulf of space, vast yet fragile, like glass waiting to shatter. The Titans did not charge, did not strike. They simply hovered, filling the void. With their presence, their silence heavier than any weapon, on the patrol ship. The navigator trembled. The lights along the Leviathan's hulls were shifting again, pulsing in patterns that seemed all too familiar. She whispered that it was the same rhythm as before, only amplified, layered, more urgent. The engineer leaned close, his eyes wide, with fear and wonder. He said the patterns were repeating, building into something too complex to be random. It was a message, a language no one had cracked, and it was directed at them. The captain's hands shook as he realized what that meant. Out of an entire fleet of warships, the Leviathans were calling to their tiny patrol vessel. He remembered the hymn, the answering light, the strange resonance that had haunted them ever since. It had not been chance. They had been chosen, marked in ways they did not understand. And now, in the moment before the galaxy shattered, the giants were waiting. For them to respond across the human fleet, tension reached breaking point. Weapons crews begged for orders. Pilots whispered prayers. Admirals argued over open channels, their voices cracking under the pressure. Some demanded an attack, terrified of appearing weak. Others insisted on silence, equally terrified of provoking a strike. The standoff stretched on, each second heavier than the last. The patrol crew felt every eye upon them. They were not supposed to matter, not supposed to be anything more than a small vessel caught in the storm. Yet now, with the giants pulsing their silent message across the void, all of humanity seemed to be waiting for them. The navigator's voice shook as she begged the captain to answer. The engineer said they had no choice. The Titans would not stop until they did. The captain stared at the endless shadows before him, at the colossal fleet greater than planets themselves, and felt the weight of a decision that could decide the fate of every world. But even as he hesitated, the Leviathans moved. Their hulls lit brighter, waves of light surging in unison, filling the void with brilliance that made stars seem dim. The human fleet panicked, weapons locking, alarms screaming. Soldiers cried out, certain the end had come. Yet the Titans did not fire. Their light only grew, rising into patterns vast and terrible, filling the gulf of space with meaning that no one could yet understand. The patrol crew watched, breathless, as the language of giants unfolded before them. The captain felt his throat tighten. The navigator pressed her hand to the glass, and the engineer whispered that the readings were off the scale. Impossible. Alive. It was not an attack. It was something far stranger, something vast, something final. And then, without warning, the Titans began to move forward. The void trembled with their advance. Every star drowned beneath their silhouettes. The human fleet braced for annihilation, for the storm to finally break. But still the Leviathans. Lights pulsed in rhythm, a message unanswered, demanding response. The captain knew the next moment would change everything. To answer or remain silent, to fight or to fall, to trust or to despair. The galaxy held its breath, waiting. The Titans advanced, their silhouettes blotting out the stars, and every ship in the human fleet braced for the end. But the attack never came. Instead, the Leviathans slowed, their formation, shifting as if choreographed by some ancient rhythm. The light pulsing along their hulls quickened, cascading into complex waves that rolled across the void. To most eyes, it was terrifying, overwhelming, but to the navigator on the patrol ship, it was something else. She gripped her console with trembling hands and whispered that the lights were not just patterns anymore. They were maps. The engineer confirmed it in disbelief. The pulses carried coordinates, star positions rearranged into unfamiliar alignments. At first it seemed like nonsense, but then the realization struck. These were not maps of known space. They pointed somewhere beyond, to places charted only, in myth and rumor. The patrol crew understood in a rush of fear that the Leviathans were not simply returning. They were guiding humanity toward something greater, something hidden. The captain's heart pounded. Across the fleet, commanders shouted in confusion, demanding translations, demanding to know why the giants slowed their advance. Some thought it a trap. Others insisted it was a summons. But before anyone could decide, the stars themselves seemed to answer. Space at the edge of the confrontation rippled, as though torn open by invisible hands. Out of that darkness emerged shapes unlike. The Leviathans, smaller, sharper, swifter. They moved with predatory grace, their hulls jagged and burning with strange fire. The fleet panicked. These were not human ships, nor were they the colossal warships of old. They were something new, something that should not have been there at all. The Titans did not flinch. They shifted formation, their vast hulls aligning like shields, placing themselves between the human fleet and the newcomers. For the first time, the galaxy realized that the Leviathans were not alone. They had enemies. Alarms blared across every vessel as the newcomers unleashed energy unlike anything seen before. Beams of tearing light cut across the void, smashing into the Titans' vast forms. The impacts shook sensors, bending gravity itself, but the Leviathans endured, their own. Lights flaring in response. Space became a battlefield of scales too large for human eyes, and yet humanity was trapped in the middle. Fragile ships drifting in the storm between gods. The admiral of the human fleet ordered an immediate retreat. Engines roared as ships scrambled to break formation, desperate to escape the crossfire. But the patrol captain held his position, watching as the Titans fought with a strange, deliberate rhythm. They did not retaliate with weapons in the way humanity understood. Instead, their lights pulsed faster, the patterns shifting into harmonics that resonated across space. The engineer gasped as his instruments shook under the vibration, readings soaring into impossible ranges. The giants were using something deeper than weapons. They were shaping the very fabric of reality, bending the void to shield themselves. The newcomers howled in frequencies that rattled every hull. Some ships reported voices whispering inside. Their minds, fragmented words that made no sense, yet filled them with dread. Others spoke of shadows crawling across their decks, though sensors detected nothing. Panic rippled through the human fleet, and discipline collapsed. Commanders shouted contradictory orders, weapons fired blindly, and ships collided in the chaos. Amid the storm, the navigator clutched her head, eyes wide in terror. She said the voices were clearer for her. She could hear them not as fragments, but as a chorus. They were not speaking to humanity. They were speaking to the Leviathans, calling them traitors, accusing them of breaking some ancient covenant. Her words chilled the bridge. Whatever the giants had become in the silence of lost decades, they were not just altered warships. They were deserters from something much larger. The captain stared at the void and felt his stomach twist. The Titans had not returned to conquer humanity. They had returned fleeing from something greater, something that was now spilling into human space. The Leviathans were not the end of the story. They were only the beginning. The battle raged on, Titans, clashing with the newcomers in silence, broken only by the roar of bending space. Human ships fled in every direction, scattering like sparks in the wind. The patrol vessel was nearly crushed as shock waves tore through the void, but still the captain held position, drawn by a conviction he could not explain. The giants' lights flashed again, brighter than ever, and the navigator cried out that they were signaling directly to their ship. The patterns had narrowed, simplified into coordinates they could actually follow. The engineer confirmed it. The Leviathans were offering them a path out, not to retreat back to the safety of the core, but to dive deeper, toward the very coordinates the giants had shown before. The decision tore at the captain. To follow meant abandoning the fleet, venturing into a place no human had ever charted. To stay meant certain destruction as the battle consumed them. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, news of the confrontation spread despite every effort to contain it. Colonies whispered of alien invaders. Councils argued over whether to declare the Titans protectors or betrayers. Refugee ships broadcast desperate pleas, warning that humanity had stumbled into a war it did not understand. And in the darkest corners of power, some leaders began to wonder whether the real danger was not the newcomers, but the Titans themselves. War machines remade into something greater than planets, who might one day decide to turn on their creators. The patrol crew's dilemma deepened as the battle reached its peak. One of the Titans was struck by a lance of burning energy, its vast hull shuddering as pieces cracked and fell into the void. The sight shook the crew to their core. For the first time, they realized the giants were not invincible. They could be hurt. They could be destroyed. And if that happened, humanity would stand naked before whatever force hunted them. The navigator pleaded to follow the coordinates. The engineer warned it could be suicide. The captain stood frozen, torn between duty to his fleet and the sense that destiny itself was pulling them forward. The lights of the Titans pulsed again, faster, brighter, urgent. They were waiting for him to choose. The newcomers surged, their weapons tearing through the void, driving the Leviathans back step by step. The human fleet scattered further. Discipline lost, survival instincts taking over. The void shook with power beyond imagination, and through it all, the patrol vessel trembled, caught in the balance. The captain's voice cracked as he gave the order to set course for the coordinates. Engines flared, and the ship broke from the chaos, diving into the unknown. The crew clung to their stations, fear and hope tangled together as stars bent around them. Behind, the Titans continued their desperate stand, holding the line against something vast, something furious. Ahead, the unknown waited, darker and more silent than anything they had ever faced. And in that moment, humanity understood the truth. The return of the lost fleets had not been the storm itself. They were the warning. The real storm was still coming. The patrol ship plunged into the darkness, carrying with it the last fragile thread of hope, while the giants, greater than planets themselves, burned with light against the tide. The void roared with battle, and the galaxy held its breath, knowing that whatever lay ahead would decide not just their survival, but the fate of everything they had ever known. The patrol ship plunged deeper into the void, engines straining as if the space around them resisted every motion. The coordinates given by the Titans burned bright on the navigator's screen, guiding them away from the chaos of the battle. Behind them, the colossal warships clashed with the newcomers in silence, their pulsing lights blazing across the black like ancient beacons. Every second carried them farther from the human fleet, farther from safety, and closer to something no one had ever dared to imagine. The engineer's voice was tight as he reported that their sensors were unraveling. distances no longer measured correctly. Stars blinked in and out, as if they were no longer fixed in place. The captain gripped the console and forced his crew to hold course, even as the ship groaned under distortions. The navigator's face was pale, but her eyes were locked on the shifting coordinates. She said softly that it wasn't just a destination, it was an entry point. The Titans had opened a passage, and they were being asked to cross it. Space itself seemed to fold around them, stretching and collapsing until every screen filled with static. For a moment, the ship was weightless, as though the universe had let go. Then, with a shudder that rattled their bones, they emerged into a place no human had charted. The stars here were unfamiliar, twisted into arcs like shattered glass. Great voids yawned between them, darker than the darkest night. And in that emptiness hung a shape so massive, it defied comprehension. It was not a planet, nor a Titan. It was something in between, a vast structure, half alive, half machine, suspended in the abyss. Its surface shifted like liquid metal, flowing and reshaping itself in slow tides. The engineer whispered that it was larger than any Titan, larger even than most stars. The navigator clutched her chair, whispering that this was the origin, the place where the fleets had been remade. The captain said nothing, because the truth was already plain. They were staring at the forge that had created gods. The ship drifted closer as if pulled by invisible hands. Their instruments screamed warnings, but the engines no longer obeyed. The closer they came, the clearer it became that the massive structure was not silent. Waves of soundless energy pulsed outward, carrying fragments of voices, human voices, distorted, layered, endless. The crew froze as the voices grew clearer. They were the voices of long-lost captains, engineers, navigators, all those who had vanished in the Silence War. Their words were not cries of pain, but fragments of orders, songs, laughter, even arguments. It was as if every crew ever lost had been absorbed into this vast living machine. The navigator's breath caught. She realized what the Titans truly were. They were not just ships remade. They were vessels bound with the minds of their crews, fused into something beyond human. The Leviathans were living warships because their humanity had been consumed to make them so. The revelation tore through the bridge like fire. The engineer shook his head in denial, the captain's knuckles turned white on the console, and the navigator wept silently, because now the lights, the patterns, the recognition, all of it made sense. The giants remembered because they still were human, in ways twisted and changed, but human all the same. As the realization sank in, the great forge stirred. Its tides of metal shifted faster, and from its surface rose new shapes, sharp and angular, like the enemies that had attacked the Titans. These were not allies. They were the wardens, the enforcers of whatever had created this place. The forge had not simply remade the fleets. It had imprisoned them, bound them into service, and punished those who tried to flee. The Titans were deserters, and the newcomers were hunters sent to drag them back. The patrol ship trembled as the wardens turned their attention to it. For a heartbeat, the captain believed they would be destroyed instantly. But instead, the forge itself reached out. Its waves of energy surged through the vessel, flooding every system with static. Lights flickered, screens cracked, and for a moment the crew felt as though something vast and ancient was looking directly into them. The navigator gasped as her mind filled with images. Fleets swallowed in fire, humans bound to their ships by force, entire worlds harvested to fuel the forge. And beneath it all, a voice, cold and merciless, whispered that humanity had been chosen long ago, not to rule, but to serve. The captain roared for the engines to break free, but the ship would not move. The engineer struggled at his station, shouting that the forge was rewriting their systems, forcing integration. The navigator's hands shook as she realized the truth. The Forge was trying to claim them, to make them part of its design, just as it had claimed the fleets decades ago. Then, the void shook. The Titans had arrived. Through the shattered stars they came, vast silhouettes blazing with light, forcing their way into the forbidden place. The wardens turned, abandoning the patrol ship, and the battle ignited. Titans clashed with their hunters, light against shadow, their resonance filling the void with thunder that had no sound. The Forge itself pulsed with anger, releasing wave after wave of destructive energy. But the Titans held their ground, shielding the fragile patrol vessel with their vast bodies. The captain knew then why they had been chosen. The Titans needed them not as weapons, but as witnesses. Humanity had to see the truth, to understand what their lost fleets had become and what they now fought against. If the Forge consumed them, the cycle would never end. But if humanity remembered, if they carried the truth back, perhaps the Titans' rebellion would not be in vain. The navigator, still trembling from the visions, shouted that the Titans were sending them one last message. She translated through sobs. They were asking humanity not to fight against them, but to fight with them. The Titans could not break free of the Forge alone. They needed humanity's will to end what had begun so long ago. The patrol ship strained as the engineer pushed the engines past their limits, guided by the Titans. Pulsing lights, a narrow path opened through the chaos, a channel of warped space carved by the giants themselves. The captain gave the order, and the vessel plunged through it, carrying with them the memory of everything they had seen. Behind them, the Titans fought with a fury that shook the stars, their vast forms burning as the Forge and its hunters closed in. They escaped. The patrol ship burst back into known space, scarred but alive. Around them, the remnants of the human fleet still scattered, reeling from the battle they could not comprehend. The captain, voice hoarse, transmitted everything: the maps, the lights, the visions, the truth of the Forge. The message spread faster than any council could stop it, carried from ship to ship, colony to colony. Humanity now knew what the Leviathans truly were, and what they fought against. And then came the twist. As the patrol crew slumped in exhaustion, their systems stabilizing, the navigator whispered in terror. She had felt something in the last pulse of the Forge before they escaped. It had not failed to claim them entirely. A fragment of its design lingered in their ship, hidden deep in the code of their systems. The Forge had left a seed. The captain's blood ran cold. The war was not just out there, beyond the stars. It was inside them now, waiting to grow. And as the Titans continued their desperate stand in the darkness, greater than planets themselves, humanity realized that the true battle was only beginning. The patrol ship drifted in silence after its escape, battered but alive, carrying with it the weight of truths too heavy for one vessel to bear. The crew sat in exhaustion, each of them replaying the same moment, the final glimpse of the Titans locked in battle with their hunters, the Forge pulsing in anger, the stars themselves trembling as if they would shatter. For a long time, no one spoke. It was the navigator who finally broke the silence, her voice quiet but steady. She reminded them that they had survived, but survival was not enough. They had been given a purpose, and humanity now carried the burden of choice. The seed of the Forge lingered inside their systems, hidden deep, undetectable to ordinary scans. The engineer spent hours running diagnostics, his hands shaking as he watched unfamiliar code branching like veins across the ship's architecture. It was dormant, silent, but he knew it was only a matter of time before it tried to awaken. He felt a gnawing guilt. Had their escape been allowed? Had the Forge intended for them to carry this infection back to humanity? The thought haunted him, but he could not find the strength to speak it aloud. Back in the core worlds, the transmission spread faster than fear itself. Images of the Forge, of the Leviathans shielding the patrol ship, of the hunters tearing through space. Every colony saw them, every council heard the voices of the lost fleets. The illusion of ignorance shattered. Humanity could no longer pretend the Titans were simply anomalies or myths. They were family, once human, still human in ways changed and strange, fighting to free themselves from a prison older and darker than anyone had guessed. The colonies reacted in chaos. Some called for immediate war, urging fleets to strike at. The Forge before it sent more hunters. Others begged for peace, fearing that open resistance would bring destruction on a scale too vast to survive. And in the shadows of these debates, factions began to split. Entire groups rose to worship the Titans openly, seeing them as martyrs who had sacrificed everything to shield their makers. Others denounced them as corrupted, claiming humanity must sever all ties before it too was consumed. The galaxy fractured. Between fear, faith, and fury, each voice louder than the last. The patrol crew became unwilling symbols. Their faces were broadcast across the stars, hailed as heroes by some and accused of betrayal by others. They gave their testimony again and again, each time haunted by the same question. Had they been chosen because of courage, or simply because they were the first ship foolish enough to sing into the void? The captain carried the weight of that question alone at night, wondering if leadership was destiny or just accident. Yet he knew one truth: silence was no longer an option. Humanity had to face what had been hidden for decades. The engineer, weary and hollow-eyed, continued to study the Forge's seed in their systems. He discovered that it was not simply corruption. It was a message, coded into its very infection, a pattern that mirrored the Titan lights. It was not designed to destroy, but to replicate, to spread the design further. The Forge had not just tried to bind them, it had tried to make them part of the same endless cycle. When he explained this to the crew, the navigator wept because it meant the Forge did not create out of malice. It created because it believed that was the only way to survive, by binding every soul, every ship, into one vast unity without choice. The Titans had rebelled against that fate, and humanity now had to decide whether to resist as well. The decision came not from the councils, but from the people. Refugees, soldiers, colonists, even smugglers began to unite in their own ways, building networks beyond the control of governments. They shared the hymn, the same song that had once been broadcast by the patrol crew. Fleets began to play it on open frequencies, sending the notes into the void as a declaration. It became a signal not of war or surrender, but of recognition. Humanity reaching out to its lost fleets, promising to remember them, promising to fight alongside them if the Titans returned. The war did not end with a single battle. The Titans remained locked beyond the passage, their lights blazing against the Forge and its hunters. Yet in the months that followed, their presence began to echo back through space. Fragments of them appeared near colonies, brief flashes of light, waves of resonance, glimpses of vast hulls that lingered for moments before vanishing again. They were not gone. They were watching. And with each glimpse, hope grew. The patrol crew remained together, bound not just by duty but by what they had seen. The navigator kept her journals filled with the patterns she still dreamed of at night, convinced the Titans were trying to teach her more. The engineer worked tirelessly to contain the Forge's seed within their systems, vowing never to let it spread, though he secretly admitted that some part of it might already be inside them. The captain spent his days navigating the new reality, leading their ship not just as a vessel of steel, but as a symbol that humanity would not look away again. The unexpected twist came quietly. Months after their escape, as the galaxy struggled with its fractured unity, the patrol ship's systems flickered without warning. The seed stirred. The engineer froze as new patterns unfolded across their consoles, not destructive, not invasive, but words. Not from the forge, from the Titans themselves. They had used the infection as a channel, twisting it against its maker, and through it, they sent a final message. Hold the line. We will return. The crew sat in stunned silence. For all the fear, for all the battles, for all the weight of what had been revealed, there was one truth that rang clearer than any other. Humanity was not alone. Their fleets were still out there, bound in forms greater than planets, fighting not for conquest, but for freedom. And when the time came, the galaxy would have to choose whether to stand with them or against them. The patrol ship drifted quietly among the stars, scarred, carrying the seed of both hope and danger. The captain looked out at the endless night and felt a strange calm. They had faced truths that should have broken them, but instead it had given them clarity. Humanity had always thought itself master of the stars, bending the void to its will. Now it knew the truth. The void held secrets greater than empires, and sometimes those secrets came back not as enemies, but as echoes of itself. The story of the missing fleets was no longer myth. It was a warning, a reminder, and a promise. The Titans greater than planets themselves had returned not to end humanity, but to remind it of what it could become if it chose freedom over fear. As the patrol ship turned toward its next horizon, the crew knew the battles were far from over, but they also knew something deeper. No matter how dark the void became, there would always be lights waiting to answer a song. And somewhere, beyond the stars, the Titans still burned.